Our mother is a burden. It's time to put her in a nursing home. My son said it so casually, like he was suggesting we switch brands of coffee, not deciding where I would spend the rest of my life. I remember the exact way the chandelier light reflected off the polished oak table, the same table I had saved up for 20 years to buy, the same table where Daniel once sat in a booster seat, kicking his legs and laughing when I served him pancakes shaped like animals. That night, no one laughed. No one even looked at me. I didn't respond. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched plate, and stood up slowly, careful not to let my chair scrape too loudly against the hardwood floor. The silence stretched behind me as I walked out of the dining room, past the framed family photos lining the hallway, each one a frozen moment of a life I no longer recognized. I said nothing because I already knew something they didn't. It hadn't started that night. People like to believe betrayal arrives in a single moment, loud and obvious, but in my experience it seeps in quietly, through small changes you almost dismiss. The way Olivia began answering questions that were directed at Daniel. The way my son stopped calling me mom and started saying we think, as if his thoughts no longer belonged to him alone. The way doors in my own house started closing more often, conversations dropping into whispers the moment I entered a room. I noticed everything, even when they thought I didn't. At 72, you learn to read silence better than words. 2 weeks before that dinner, I found a document on the printer in Daniel's home office. It wasn't hidden. That was the first mistake. It was a brochure, glossy and impersonal, showing smiling elderly people playing checkers in a sunlit courtyard. Assisted living options in Cook County, it read across the top in soft blue letters. I remember running my fingers over the paper, feeling the slight texture of the ink, as if touching it might make it less real. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I placed it exactly where I found it and walked back to the kitchen, where Olivia was standing by the sink, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, smiled that perfectly measured smile of hers, and asked if I needed anything. I told her no. I always told her no. Because needing something had become dangerous in that house. It meant giving them permission to decide what I deserved. After my husband, Richard, passed away 3 years ago, I thought the hardest part would be the loneliness. I was wrong. Loneliness is quiet, almost gentle compared to the sharp, deliberate way people can make you feel unnecessary. Richard used to say this house was my kingdom. Every wall, every tile, every nail, he'd tell me. You held this place together. And for decades I believed him. I raised Daniel here. I hosted every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, every birthday with too much cake and too many candles. I remembered everyone's favorite dishes, everyone's allergies, everyone's schedules. I made sure this house felt like home. Somewhere along the way it stopped being mine. It became something else. Something transactional. Something they were waiting to take over. That night at dinner wasn't a sudden decision. It was a conclusion they had already reached. I saw it in the way Daniel avoided my eyes, in the way Olivia leaned back in her chair with quiet confidence, as if the outcome had already been secured. They thought they were being practical, efficient. They thought they were solving a problem. Me. I reached my bedroom and closed the door softly behind me. The air felt different there, heavier, filled with memories that refused to leave. Richard's old watch still sat on the dresser, frozen at the exact time it stopped the day he passed. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, and for a moment, I let myself feel the weight of everything I had lost. Not just my husband, but my place in this family. My role. My identity. I set the watch back down carefully, aligning it exactly as it had been before. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall across from me, where a faint mark still lingered from when Daniel had thrown a baseball indoors as a child. I never painted over it. I wanted to remember. I always wanted to remember. Downstairs I could hear faint laughter now. The dinner had resumed. My absence hadn't paused anything. It hadn't changed the rhythm of their evening at all. That was the moment I understood something with absolute clarity. I was no longer part of their world. I was an inconvenience they were preparing to relocate. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the dark outline of the backyard. The garden was still there, though no one had tended it in months. The roses had grown wild, their branches twisting in unpredictable directions, reaching for space, for light, for survival. I watched them for a long time, then let the curtain fall back into place. They thought they had already decided my future. They thought this story was simple, but they had overlooked one thing. I had spent my entire life building everything they now stood on. And I wasn't done yet. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the faint ticking of the thermostat, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the temperature dropped outside. It was early fall in Illinois, the kind of night where the air carried just a hint of cold, enough to remind you that change was coming whether you were ready or not. I used to find comfort in those sounds. They meant the house was alive, steady, familiar. But now every sound felt distant, like it belonged to a place I was only visiting. At around 2 in the morning I got up. Not because I was restless but because lying there pretending everything was normal felt dishonest. I slipped on my robe and walked quietly down the hallway, my bare feet memorizing each plank of wood, each subtle dip in the floor that had formed over decades. When I reached the kitchen I did not turn on the lights right away. I stood there in the dark letting my eyes adjust, letting myself feel the space as it was now, not as I remembered it. The outline of the kitchen island, the stainless steel refrigerator, the cabinets I had painted myself 10 years ago in a soft cream color that Richard used to say made the whole room feel warmer. Eventually I reached for the light switch. The brightness was almost harsh, exposing everything too clearly. The sink was empty. The dishes from dinner had been cleaned and put away. Olivia always made sure things looked perfect on the surface. I walked over to the coffee maker and began preparing a pot, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring water into the reservoir with the same steady hands I had used every morning for years. Routine was something no one could take from me. Not yet. While the coffee brewed, I noticed something small but out of place. The drawer beside the refrigerator was slightly open. Just an inch, maybe less, but enough for me to notice. I had closed it before dinner. I was certain of that. I walked over slowly and pulled it open the rest of the way. Inside were the usual things: takeout menus, spare keys, old receipts, but something had been moved. The envelopes were no longer stacked neatly. They were shifted, uneven, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry or without care. I reached in and picked them up one by one, scanning without really expecting to find anything, until I saw my name. Not handwritten but printed. A formal envelope, heavier than the others. My name and address typed in clean black ink. I did not remember seeing it before. I opened it carefully, sliding the paper out without tearing the edges. It was a statement. A financial summary from an account I recognized immediately. Richard's account. The one he had always handled himself, the one he told me not to worry about because he had everything arranged. My eyes moved across the page slowly, deliberately. Numbers. Transfers. Dates. And then something that made my chest tighten, not in panic but in recognition. There had been withdrawals. Large ones. Over the past 6 months. Consistent. Planned. Authorized. But not by me. I stood there for a long moment, holding the paper, letting the information settle into place. This was not carelessness. This was not confusion. This was strategy. I folded the document neatly and placed it back into the envelope, then returned it exactly where I had found it. I did not rush. I did not react. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, the same seat I had taken thousands of times before, and stared out the window at the faint outline of the backyard. The sky was beginning to lighten just slightly, that soft gray before sunrise. Somewhere in the distance a car passed by, its tires humming against the pavement. Life outside this house was continuing unchanged. Inside, everything had shifted. I thought about Daniel as a child, the way he used to run into the kitchen every morning asking what was for breakfast, the way he would sit at this very table swinging his legs, completely unaware of the effort it took to make a home feel safe, stable, permanent. I thought about how easily that innocence had been replaced with something else. Something colder. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. Upstairs I heard a door open. Footsteps. Slow, measured. Olivia. She always woke up early, always maintained her routines with quiet precision. I did not turn around. I did not acknowledge her presence when she entered the kitchen. I simply took another sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. She paused for a moment, just long enough for me to know she had noticed something was different, then walked to the refrigerator and opened it, her movements calm, controlled. "Good morning," she said lightly, as if nothing had changed, as if the previous night had been ordinary. I nodded once, still facing the window. "Good morning." My voice sounded exactly as it always did. Steady. Unaffected. That was the second mistake they made. They believed that because I was quiet I was unaware. Because I did not confront them I did not understand. They thought they had time. Time to arrange things, to move pieces into place, to finalize decisions about my life without my involvement. I set my cup down gently on the table and finally turned my head slightly, just enough to catch Olivia's reflection in the window. She was watching me, not directly but carefully, as if trying to measure how much I knew. I offered her a small, polite smile, the kind that revealed nothing. And in that moment I made a decision. If they wanted to plan my future without me, then I would let them. I would watch. I would listen. And when the time came, I would make sure they understood exactly who they had been underestimating. By the time the sun rose fully, the house had already settled into its usual rhythm, but I no longer saw it the same way. Every sound, every movement carried meaning now. The soft click of Olivia's heels against the kitchen tile, the low murmur of Daniel's voice as he took a call in the living room, even the way the refrigerator door closed just a second too quickly, as if something needed to be hidden rather than simply stored. I moved through the morning as I always did, rinsing my cup, wiping down the counter, straightening the stack of mail, but my attention was no longer on the tasks themselves. It was on them, on the patterns, on the spaces between what was said and what was avoided. Daniel left for work just after 8. He did not mention the night before. He did not apologize. He did not even hesitate. He grabbed his keys, gave Olivia a brief glance, and walked out the front door as if everything had already been decided and there was no reason to revisit it. I watched him through the window as he got into his car, adjusted his mirror and drove away. There was a time when he would have turned back, waved, something small to acknowledge that I was there. This time there was nothing. Olivia remained in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, her posture relaxed in a way that told me she felt no urgency, no pressure. That kind of calm does not come from uncertainty. Comes from believing you are in control. Around 9 she excused herself, saying she had errands to run. She did not specify what kind. She did not ask if I needed anything. She simply took her bag and left, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality that echoed longer than it should have. The house was mine again, at least for a few hours. I did not waste that time. I walked back to Daniel's office, the one room in the house that still carried traces of how it used to be. The desk was the same, the shelves lined with books he rarely read anymore, the faint smell of leather and paper still lingering in the air. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening, making sure the silence was complete, then stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. I did not search wildly. I did not open every drawer or scatter papers across the desk. That would have been careless. Instead, I moved with intention, checking only the places that mattered. The filing cabinet first. Locked. That was new. Daniel had never locked anything in this house before. Not when he was younger, not even after he moved back in. Lock suggests fear. Or secrecy. I made a mental note and moved on. The desk drawer on the right side was slightly heavier than it should have been. When I opened it, I found a neatly organized stack of folders, each labeled in Olivia's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Clean. Precise. Controlled. I flipped through them slowly, reading each label without removing the contents. Property. Insurance. Estate planning. That last one made me pause. I slid the folder out just enough to glance at the top page. Legal language. Dates. Names. My name. And beneath it, Daniel's. I did not read further. Not yet. I returned the folder to its exact position and closed the drawer carefully, making sure everything looked untouched. Rushing leads to mistakes. And I could not afford mistakes. Instead, I stepped back and looked around the room again, this time not as a mother remembering her son, but as someone studying a situation that required precision. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a conversation they were planning to have with me. This was a process already in motion. The assisted living brochure. The financial withdrawals. The estate documents. Each piece fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. I left the office and walked back into the hallway, my movements slow, deliberate, giving myself time to think. By the time Olivia returned, I was sitting in the living room with a book open in my lap, my glasses resting low on my nose, exactly as she expected to find me. She placed her keys on the counter and glanced in my direction, her eyes scanning quickly, assessing, calculating. "Did you have a quiet morning?" she asked casually. I looked up, offering the same gentle expression I had worn for years. "Yes," I said. "Very quiet." And that was the truth. Quiet enough to hear everything I needed to hear. Quiet enough to understand that whatever they were planning, they believed I would simply follow along. Adjust. Accept. Disappear into whatever arrangement they had chosen for me. I lowered my gaze back to the book, though I was not reading a single word. Because now, for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would happen next. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, my hand resting lightly against the frame, as if I needed something solid to steady me. The room had not changed much over the years. The same soft beige walls, the same quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the same curtains Richard had insisted on installing himself one summer afternoon when he decided the old ones were letting in too much light. Back then, everything in this room had felt intentional, chosen with care, built together. Now it felt preserved, like a place no one quite knew what to do with anymore. I stepped inside slowly and closed the door behind me, not out of habit, but out of instinct. This was the one space that still belonged to me, or at least it used to. I walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, the one where Richard kept his personal papers. I had not gone through them in months, not since the days right after he passed when everything felt too raw, too immediate. But now, standing there, I realized something I should have understood sooner. Richard had never been careless. Not with money, not with documents, not with the future. He believed in preparation, in making sure that the people he loved would be protected, even when he was no longer there to do it himself. I sifted through the contents carefully, lifting each folder, each envelope, until I found what I was looking for. The envelope was thicker than the others, sealed but not hidden, as if it had been placed there with the expectation that I would eventually open it. My name was written on the front in Richard's handwriting, slightly slanted, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I sat down on the edge of the bed before opening it, taking a moment to steady my hands. When I finally slid the paper out, the first thing I noticed was the date. It had been written just 6 months before he passed. That alone told me this was important. Richard did not make last-minute decisions without reason. I began to read slowly at first, then more carefully as the meaning started to unfold. It was not just a letter. It was an addition. A formal statement, witnessed, documented, precise. He had outlined conditions, protections, specific instructions regarding the house, the accounts, the assets we had built together over decades. And woven through the legal language was something else. Intent. Clear, unmistakable intent. This was not about distribution. It was about safeguarding. I felt something shift inside me, not relief exactly, but clarity. The kind that settles quietly, replacing confusion with understanding. Everything Daniel and Olivia were doing suddenly made more sense. The withdrawals, the documents, the urgency. They were not just planning my future. They were trying to get ahead of something they either did not fully understand or hoped I never would. I folded the papers carefully and returned them to the envelope, then placed it back in the drawer exactly where I had found it. Not because I was finished, but because I was not ready to show my hand. Not yet. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the street beyond the front yard. A delivery truck passed by, stopping briefly at the neighbor's house before moving on. Ordinary life continuing unchanged, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening behind these walls. I thought about Richard then, about the way he used to watch people not with suspicion but with a kind of quiet awareness. He used to say that you could learn everything you needed to know about someone by what they did when they thought no one was paying attention. I had not understood that fully until now. I turned away from the window and glanced around the room one more time, taking in the details I had once taken for granted. The framed photograph on the nightstand. The indentation in the mattress where Richard used to sleep. The faint scent of his cologne that still lingered, stubborn and familiar. This room was not just a memory. It was a reminder of what had been built, of what had been promised, and of what was now at risk of being taken, not through force but through quiet manipulation. Downstairs I heard the front door open. Voices. Daniel was home earlier than usual. I checked the time. Just after 4. That was not typical. I moved toward the door and paused, listening. Their voices were low, but there was tension in them now. Urgency. A difference in tone that had not been there before. Something had shifted for them too. I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, my expression calm, my movements measured. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I had already decided how I would proceed. They believed they were in control. They believed I was behind them, catching up slowly, unaware of the full picture. I would let them believe that a little longer, because the truth was I was no longer trying to understand what they were doing. I already did. Now I was deciding what I would do next. That evening, I did not wait for them to call me to the table. I walked into the dining room at exactly 6 o'clock, the same time dinner had always been served in this house, and took my usual seat without asking if it was still mine. Olivia glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable, while Daniel paused mid-step, as if he had not expected me to arrive on my own terms. Small disruptions matter. They remind people that control is never as complete as they believe. The table was set neatly as always. 3 plates. 3 glasses. Everything in its place. Olivia had prepared something simple: roasted chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. The kind of meal that looks comforting but carries no real effort behind it. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. No one spoke at first. The silence was not awkward. It was careful. Measured. Each of us aware that something had changed, even if no one was willing to name it. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for the serving spoon, placing food onto his plate without looking at me. Olivia followed, her movements smooth, controlled, practiced. When the bowl of potatoes reached me, I took a small portion, just enough to maintain the rhythm of the meal. I had learned long ago that refusing food invites questions, and questions were not something I wanted yet. About halfway through dinner, Olivia set her fork down and looked at Daniel. A silent cue. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something already discussed. That was when I knew. The conversation they had postponed the night before was about to begin again, but this time it would be framed differently. Softer. More reasonable. That is how these things are done when people want to believe they are being kind. Mom, Daniel started. His voice carefully neutral. We have been thinking about what is best moving forward. I did not look up immediately. I finished chewing, took a sip of water, then placed my glass down gently before meeting his eyes. That was all the invitation he needed. The conversation continued, words arranged to sound considerate, supportive, logical. He spoke about convenience, about safety, about how living alone in a house this size was not practical anymore. Olivia added small comments at the right moments, reinforcing his points without ever appearing to lead them. It was almost impressive the way they had rehearsed it. I listened to everything. I nodded where appropriate. I even asked a few quiet questions, the kind that made it seem like I was considering their suggestion rather than evaluating their intentions. And the more I listened, the clearer it became. They were not asking. They were presenting a plan. A timeline. A transition already mapped out in their minds. There was a facility not far from here, Olivia said gently, as if distance was the deciding factor. They have excellent reviews and the community there is very active. I imagined the brochure again. The smiling faces. The sunlight that never quite felt real. It would not be forever, Daniel added quickly, as if sensing the need to soften the impact. Just until things are more manageable. I almost smiled at that. Temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when they serve the right people. I placed my fork down and rested my hands on the table, folding them together the way I had done 1,000 times before. Then I nodded once, slowly, deliberately. That sounds reasonable, I said. My voice was calm. Even. Exactly what they wanted to hear. Daniel blinked just for a second, caught off guard by how easily I agreed. Olivia's shoulders relaxed slightly, a tension I had not noticed before finally releasing. They had expected resistance. Emotion. Difficulty. Instead, I gave them acceptance. It was the third mistake they made. because agreement when given too easily is often misunderstood. They began to talk more freely after that. Details. Logistics. Dates. Olivia mentioned scheduling a visit later in the week just to see the place, just to get a feel for it. Daniel talked about paperwork, about making sure everything was handled smoothly. I listened. I nodded. I asked one question. When do you think this would happen? Soon, Olivia said, her tone careful but firm. Within the next few weeks, ideally. Of course it would be soon. Plans like this are never meant to linger. They are meant to be executed before anything can interrupt them. I picked up my glass again and took another sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle the moment. Then I nodded once more. That should be fine, I said. And just like that, the decision was sealed in their minds. They had what they wanted. My agreement. My compliance. My quiet cooperation. Dinner continued after that, lighter now, almost relaxed. They spoke about other things, work, errands, trivial details that filled the space where something heavier should have remained. I ate slowly, finishing what was on my plate, participating just enough to maintain the illusion. When the meal ended, I stood up, gathered my dish, and carried it to the sink. Olivia moved to stop me, offering to take care of it, but I shook my head gently. It is fine, I said. I have always taken care of my own things. I rinsed the plate, placed it in the dishwasher, and dried my hands on the towel by the sink. Then I turned, offering them a small, polite smile. Thank you for dinner. And with that, I walked out of the kitchen and back toward the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried. Behind me, I could feel their relief, their certainty that everything was now moving exactly as they had planned. But as I reached the staircase and placed my hand on the railing, I allowed myself a moment of quiet clarity. They believed I had agreed to their plan. What they did not realize was that I had just given them exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of everything else. There was a clarity now that had not been there before. A quiet understanding that the situation was no longer unfolding around me, but through me. I got dressed carefully, choosing one of my older coats, the beige wool one Richard had bought me years ago during a winter trip to Chicago. It still fit well, still held its shape, and more importantly, it made me feel like myself. I moved through the house quietly, preparing a simple breakfast, toast and coffee, just enough to maintain the routine. Olivia came downstairs shortly after, her expression calm, her tone light, as if the previous evening had settled everything between us. She asked if I was feeling all right, if I had thought more about the facility they mentioned. I nodded gently, offering the same cooperative tone I had used the night before. I told her I thought it was a good idea to visit, to understand what the place was like before making any final decisions. She seemed pleased with that answer, more relaxed than I had seen her in weeks. That was the effect of agreement. It lowers defenses. It makes people careless. Daniel had already left for work by then, which suited me just fine. There are conversations that are easier to have when certain people are not present. Around 10 o'clock, I picked up my purse and told Olivia I was going out for a walk. She offered to drive me somewhere to help, but I declined. I have always preferred walking. Gives me time to think. The air outside was crisp, the kind of early autumn morning that feels both refreshing and slightly unforgiving. Leaves had begun to gather along the edges of the sidewalk, dry and brittle underfoot. I walked slowly at first, allowing myself to settle into the rhythm, then gradually picked up my pace as I turned the corner and headed toward the main road. I did not go far. Just 3 blocks down, then another 2 to the right, until I reached a small office building I had not visited in quite some time. The sign out front had not changed. Carter & Wells, Attorneys at Law. I stood there for a moment, looking at the lettering, letting the familiarity of it ground me before I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, surprised at first, then smiled politely. I gave my name, and within a few minutes, I was sitting across from a man who had known my husband for over 20 years. Mr. Carter had aged, of course, but his eyes were the same, sharp, observant, the kind that missed very little. He listened as I spoke, not interrupting, not rushing me, allowing me to explain only what was necessary. I did not dramatize anything. I did not accuse. I simply presented the facts as I had observed them. The documents. The withdrawals. The conversation about moving me out. When I finished, He leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me for a moment before nodding. He asked if I had seen the letter Richard left. I told him I had. That I understood enough to know it mattered but not enough to know exactly how. He opened a folder on his desk and slid a copy of the document toward me, pointing to specific sections, explaining in clear, precise terms what Richard had put in place. Safeguards, conditions, legal protections that had been designed not just to preserve assets, but to ensure control remained where it was intended. With me. The house was not transferable without my consent. The accounts could not be accessed in the way they had been without triggering a review. And most importantly, any attempt to relocate me under the pretense of incapacity would require formal evaluation, documentation, and oversight. In other words, nothing they were planning could be completed quietly, not if I chose to respond. I listened carefully, asking only a few questions, making sure I understood not just the words, but the implications. When he finished, I nodded once and folded my hands in my lap. Then I asked him something very simple. What happens if I say nothing? He considered that for a moment before answering. Then they will continue, he said. They will move forward, assuming they are unchallenged. I let that settle for a second, then nodded again. Good, I said quietly. That is exactly what I want. He looked at me differently then, not with concern but with recognition. He understood. I stood up, thanked him for his time, and left the office without taking any documents with me. I did not need to carry proof. I already had what I needed. The walk back felt different. Lighter in some ways but sharper in others. The air had warmed slightly, the sun now higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk. By the time I reached the house, I had already decided how the next few days would unfold. Olivia greeted me when I stepped inside, asking how my walk had been. I smiled politely and told her it was refreshing. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to whatever she had been doing. I hung my coat carefully, placed my purse on the table, and stood there for just a moment, taking in the quiet of the house. Everything looked the same. Everything felt the same. And yet, nothing was the same anymore. Because now, for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer reacting to their plan. I was allowing it to move forward exactly as they intended. And that was not weakness. That was strategy. The following days unfolded exactly as I expected, not because I had predicted every detail, but because people tend to follow patterns when they believe they are in control. Olivia became more attentive, but in a way that felt calculated rather than genuine. She asked about my preferences, what kind of room I might like, whether I would prefer a place with a garden or one with more indoor activities. Her tone was always soft, always considerate, but there was a structure to it, a quiet urgency beneath the surface that revealed more than her words ever did. Daniel, on the other hand, kept his distance. He was polite, respectful even, but detached, as if maintaining space would make the transition easier for both of us. It did not. It only made everything clearer. 3 days after our dinner, Olivia approached me in the living room with a folder in her hands. She sat across from me, placing the folder neatly on the coffee table before opening it. Inside were brochures, printed pages, and what appeared to be preliminary paperwork. She explained that she had scheduled a visit for the coming Saturday. Just a simple tour, nothing formal, just an opportunity for me to see the place and ask questions. I listened carefully, nodding at the appropriate moments, allowing her to guide the conversation exactly as she intended. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for a response. I offered a small, thoughtful pause, then agreed. That sounds like a good idea, I said. It is important to understand all the options. Her relief was subtle, but unmistakable. Another step completed. Another piece in place. That evening, Daniel joined us briefly in the living room. Olivia shared the plan with him, repeating the details as if confirming them in real time. He nodded, occasionally adding a comment about convenience or timing, but his focus remained on Olivia, not on me. That was the pattern now. Decisions were made between them, and then presented to me as conclusions. I did not challenge it. Not because I accepted it, but because I needed them to believe I did. On Friday morning I took another walk. The same route, the same pace. But this time my mind was not focused on what they were planning. It was focused on what I had already set in motion. The conversation with Mr. Carter had not ended in his office. It had simply begun there. By the time I returned home, there were already steps being taken quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. That was the advantage of preparation. It does not require noise. It requires timing. When I stepped inside, Olivia was in the kitchen, reviewing something on her laptop. She looked up and smiled, asking if I was ready for the next day. I told her I was, and I meant it, because readiness does not always look like anticipation. Sometimes it looks like patience. Saturday arrived with a kind of calm that felt almost deliberate. The sky was clear, the air cool but not cold, the kind of morning that suggests everything is exactly as it should be. Olivia was dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, her expression focused. Daniel seemed slightly more alert than usual, as if he understood that this was an important step, even if he could not fully articulate why. We left the house just after 10, Olivia driving, Daniel in the passenger seat, and me in the back. I watched the neighborhood pass by through the window, familiar streets gradually giving way to less familiar ones, then to areas I had never seen before. The facility was located about 20 minutes away, set back from the main road, surrounded by neatly maintained lawns and carefully arranged landscaping. It looked exactly like the brochure. Clean, orderly, inviting in a way that felt almost too perfect. We were greeted at the entrance by a woman with a warm smile and a practiced tone. She introduced herself, welcomed us in, and began the tour without hesitation. She spoke about community, about comfort, about care. She showed us common areas, dining spaces, activity rooms filled with puzzles and books and televisions tuned to channels no one seemed to be watching. I listened to everything. I asked a few questions. I even smiled at the appropriate moments. Olivia stayed close, occasionally placing a hand lightly on my arm, as if offering support. Daniel followed just behind us, quiet, observant, present but not fully engaged. It was all exactly as I expected. At one point, the woman leading the tour asked if I had any concerns. I paused for a moment, considering the question carefully, then shook my head gently. No, I said. It seems very well managed. Olivia smiled at that. Daniel nodded. The woman seemed pleased. Everything was proceeding smoothly, exactly as planned. But as we continued walking through the hallway, past doors that all looked the same, past rooms that all carried the same quiet stillness, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not doubt, not fear, certainty, because now I had seen what they had chosen for me. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. We returned home just after noon, and the moment we stepped inside, I could feel the shift in the air. Not tension, not yet, but something quieter, something expectant. Olivia moved immediately into the kitchen, placing her keys down and beginning to talk about the facility in a tone that suggested everything had gone exactly as planned. She mentioned the cleanliness, the staff, the programs, repeating the same points the woman had highlighted during the tour, as if reinforcing the decision before it had even been formally made. Daniel agreed with her, adding small observations of his own, but he still did not look at me directly. He spoke around me, not to me. That had become his way of managing discomfort. I removed my coat slowly, hanging it on the rack by the door, taking my time with the small, ordinary motions that grounded me. Then I walked into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. They followed a moment later, Olivia taking the seat across from me, Daniel standing briefly before settling beside her. There was a pause then, a quiet space where something needed to be said. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her expression composed, her voice gentle. What did you think? She asked. I let the question sit for a moment, not because I needed time to answer, but because silence often reveals more than words. Then I nodded once slowly. It is very well organized, I said. Clean, efficient, exactly what it appears to be. That seemed to satisfy her at first, but I could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for more. For agreement. For confirmation. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at her before finally looking at me. Do you feel comfortable there? He asked. The question was simple, but the intention behind it was not. Comfort is a word people use when they want to make something sound optional, even when it is not. I met his eyes steadily, holding his gaze just long enough to remind him that I was still here, still present, still aware. Then I gave a small measured nod. I understand why you chose it, I said. That was enough. They exchanged a brief look, subtle but meaningful, the kind of silent agreement that comes from believing a decision has been accepted. Olivia reached for the folder she had prepared earlier in the week and placed it on the table between us. Inside were documents, forms, outlines of the next steps. She opened it carefully, turning the pages toward me as she explained each section, her voice calm, practiced, confident. Admission paperwork, medical history, financial arrangements. Everything laid out clearly, efficiently, as if this were simply another task to be completed. I listened to every word. I watched every movement. And I noticed something they did not expect me to notice. The confidence had grown. Not cautious anymore, not measured. Certain. They believed they had crossed the point where I might resist. That belief changes behavior. It makes people less careful. Olivia paused after explaining the final page and looked at me, her expression open, encouraging. We can start this process as soon as you are ready, she said. There is no rush, of course, but it is better to plan ahead. I placed my hand lightly on the folder, not opening it, just resting my fingers against the edge. Then I looked up at both of them, my expression calm, my voice steady. You have already started the process, I said quietly. The words were not accusatory. They were factual. Daniel blinked just slightly, caught off guard by the precision of the statement. Olivia's smile held for a moment longer than it should have before softening into something more controlled. We just wanted to be prepared, she replied smoothly. That is. Oh, of course, I said. Preparation is important. I let the silence settle again, watching as they waited for me to continue, expecting agreement, expecting the final step. Instead, I reached forward and closed the folder gently, aligning the edges with careful precision. Then I folded my hands again and leaned back in my chair. There is just one thing, I added. Their attention sharpened immediately. A small shift but unmistakable. A condition, I continued, my tone unchanged, my posture relaxed. Before anything moves forward, there are a few details that need to be clarified. Daniel straightened slightly, his expression uncertain now, the confidence from earlier beginning to fracture. Olivia remained composed, but I could see it in her eyes, the calculation adjusting, the plan shifting to accommodate something unexpected. What kind of details, she asked. I held her gaze for a moment, then allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form. The kind that reveals nothing, but promises something else entirely. Legal ones, I said simply. And in that moment the balance in the room changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Enough for them to realize, perhaps for the first time, that this was not as simple as they had believed. Enough for them to understand that the conversation was no longer moving in one direction. And as I sat there, calm, steady, completely in control of my voice and my expression, I could feel it clearly. The shift had begun. The room did not change, but the way they sat in it did. Daniel leaned forward now, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, his posture no longer relaxed but alert, as if something had shifted just enough to pull him out of the certainty he had been holding on to. Olivia remained composed, but I could see the adjustment in her expression, the subtle tightening around her eyes, the careful recalibration of someone who was used to controlling the direction of a conversation, and had just realized that control was no longer guaranteed. Neither of them spoke immediately. They were waiting, measuring, trying to determine how much I knew and how much I was willing to say. I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch, steady and deliberate, until it became uncomfortable enough that Daniel cleared his throat again. What kind of legal details, Mom? He asked, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. I turned my attention to him fully, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something far more difficult to ignore. Clarity. The kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. The kind that does not ask for permission. The kind that simply exists. The kind your father put in place before he passed, I said. His name landed in the room differently than anything else I had said. It always did. For a moment, neither of them moved. Olivia's hand, which had been resting lightly on the folder, stilled completely. Daniel blinked, his expression tightening as if he was trying to recall something he had not considered in a long time. I continued, my voice even, my tone measured. Richard did not leave things unfinished. He made sure everything was documented. Everything was protected. Including me. I watched as the understanding began to surface, not fully formed yet, but enough to disrupt the confidence they had been carrying. Olivia was the first to respond. "Of course," she said carefully, her voice smooth but no longer as effortless as before. "We are aware of the will. We would never do anything that goes against it." I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. "The will is only part of it," I replied. "There are conditions. Specific ones." Daniel shifted in his seat again, his gaze now fixed on me, searching, uncertain. "What kind of conditions?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke with the same calm precision I had maintained since the beginning. "The kind that requires my consent," I said. "The kind that prevents decisions about my living arrangements from being made without proper evaluation. The kind that triggers a review if financial activity does not align with the original structure." The words were not accusations. They were facts. Simple, clear, undeniable. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Olivia leaned back slightly, her posture adjusting as if she needed space to think. Daniel's expression shifted completely now, the distance he had maintained over the past days replaced with something else. Awareness. Not of what they had planned but of what they had overlooked. I reached forward and lightly touched the closed folder on the table, not opening it, just acknowledging its presence. "You have been very thorough," I said. "The research, the planning, the timing." I paused, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. But so was he. Silence followed. Not the careful silence from before, but something heavier, something that carried recognition. I stood up then, slowly, without urgency, without hesitation. They both watched me, neither interrupting, neither attempting to redirect the conversation. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. I walked past the table, past the place where we had just sat discussing my future as if it were already decided, and moved toward the hallway. When I reached the staircase, I paused briefly, turning just enough to look back at them. "There is no need to rush anything," I said calmly. "We will handle this properly, legally, together." The word "together" hung in the air, not as an invitation but as a boundary. Then I turned and began to walk upstairs, my steps steady, unhurried, each one deliberate. I did not need to hear what they said after that. I did not need to see the expressions they exchanged or the questions that would inevitably follow, because the shift had already happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. They had believed I was a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be relocated, a burden to be reduced. But burdens do not build foundations. Burdens do not create the structures others rely on. And as I reached the top of the stairs and continued down the hallway toward my room, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had not been preparing my future. They had been testing the limits of what they thought I would allow. And now, for the first time, they knew exactly where those limits were.